You wake up tired before the day even begins. Not physically, existentially. And the disturbing part is, your life probably looks more comfortable than any generation before you. Food arrives in minutes. Entertainment never ends. Validation is one swipe away. Every inconvenience has been hunted down like an enemy of progress. Yet somehow, your mind feels heavier than people who survived harder lives with fewer choices and less certainty. That contradiction should bother you. Because if comfort was truly the answer, your generation should be the happiest in history. Instead, millions of people are lying awake at 2 a.m. staring at ceilings they worked years to afford, feeling emotionally hollow inside lives they were told would finally make them feel complete. Something is wrong with the formula. But most people never stop long enough to question it. They assume the problem is personal. Maybe they need more money, a better relationship, more followers, a different city, a cleaner diet, another productivity system, another dopamine hit disguised as self-care. So they continue running toward the same thing that's quietly destroying them. Happiness. Not real peace. Not meaning. Not discipline. Not fulfillment earned through resistance. Just the modern version of happiness. The sanitized one. The commercialized one. The version sold through screens by people who secretly depend on your dissatisfaction to stay profitable. And before you reject that idea, you need to understand something uncomfortable. The world no longer makes money when you become content. It makes money when you remain emotionally unstable enough to keep consuming. That changes everything, because now your sadness is not just an emotion. It's a market. Your insecurity funds industries. Your loneliness feeds algorithms. Your boredom drives economies. And the more emotionally dependent you become on stimulation, the weaker your ability to feel genuine joy becomes. That's the trap nobody warned you about. You were taught to chase pleasure without understanding adaptation. A dangerous mistake, because the human nervous system was never designed to sustain permanent satisfaction. It adjusts, fast. The thing you once prayed for eventually becomes your emotional baseline. The phone that excited you for weeks becomes invisible in your hand. The relationship that once consumed your thoughts becomes routine. The success you thought would transform your identity becomes another ordinary Tuesday. Then the mind does what it always does. It raises the standard again. More, better, faster, newer. This is why modern people are trapped in permanent emotional escalation. Nothing lasts long enough anymore. Not attention, not gratitude, not fulfillment. You keep upgrading your lifestyle while your nervous system keeps downgrading its ability to feel alive. And nobody notices it happening because the process feels normal. That's the terrifying part. Misery in 2026 rarely looks dramatic. It looks functional. It looks like laughing in public while feeling numb in private. It looks like scrolling for hours because silence feels threatening. It looks like needing constant stimulation just to avoid confronting your own thoughts. It looks like exhaustion disguised as ambition. It looks like calling yourself burned out, when the truth is deeper than that. You are overstimulated, overfed, over-entertained, over-distracted, and internally starving. Most people think suffering comes from deprivation. But some of the deepest suffering comes from excess. Too much noise, too much access, too much convenience, too much dopamine without meaning attached to it. The modern world has accidentally created humans who can experience pleasure constantly while feeling emotionally dead at the same time. That should sound impossible, but you already know it's true. Think about the last time you achieved something you desperately wanted. How long did the feeling actually last? Be honest. A day, a week, maybe an hour before your mind moved the goalpost again. That's because modern happiness functions like a drug with collapsing returns. The first hit feels powerful. Then the brain adapts. Then you need more stimulation to recreate the same emotional effect. And eventually, you stop chasing happiness because you enjoy it. You chase it because you're afraid of feeling empty without it. That's dependency. And entire industries are engineered around strengthening it. Look carefully at the world around you. Everything competes for your nervous system. Apps are designed to interrupt your attention before your mind settles. Platforms study your impulses more carefully than you study yourself. Notifications arrive like psychological bait. Even your entertainment is optimized for retention, not restoration. You're not consuming content anymore. Content is consuming your capacity to sit still. This is why silence feels unbearable to so many people now. Not because silence is painful. Because silence reveals things distraction was hiding. Regret, fear, aimlessness, identity confusion, emotional weakness. The terrifying realization that you've spent years stimulating yourself instead of understanding yourself. And when people finally encounter that silence, they panic. So they reopen the app, restart the music, refresh the feed, order something unnecessary, text someone they don't even miss, watch another video they won't remember tomorrow. Anything to avoid friction. But friction is exactly where meaning begins. That's the irony modern culture refuses to admit. The things that make human beings strongest rarely feel pleasant in the moment. Discipline feels restrictive. Training feels exhausting. Honest self-reflection feels brutal. Growth feels uncomfortable. Real love requires sacrifice. Mastery demands repetition. Purpose often emerges through responsibility, not pleasure. Yet modern culture keeps whispering the opposite message into your ear. Ease is the goal, and slowly, without realizing it, people start structuring their entire lives around minimizing discomfort. But the human mind weakens when it never encounters resistance. You can see it everywhere now. Tiny inconveniences triggering massive emotional reactions. People collapsing under criticism they would have survived 10 years ago. Attention spans shattered into fragments. Patience disappearing. Impulse control eroding. Emotional resilience becoming rare. The frightening part is that most people still think they're pursuing happiness. They don't realize they're actually reducing their tolerance for life itself. Because when your nervous system becomes addicted to constant comfort, ordinary reality begins to feel unbearable. A delayed text feels like rejection. Boredom feels like suffering. Silence feels like loneliness. Difficulty feels unfair. Waiting feels intolerable. And eventually, life itself starts feeling hostile simply because it no longer delivers instant emotional rewards every few seconds. This is what happens when pleasure stops being a reward and becomes a baseline expectation. You become fragile, not physically, psychologically. There's a reason ancient Stoics warned against dependence on external comfort long before smartphones existed. They understood a truth modern society forgot. A man who cannot tolerate discomfort becomes a slave to circumstance. And slaves are easy to control. Think carefully about your own habits. How often do you reach for stimulation automatically? Not intentionally, automatically. The moment boredom appears, the second discomfort enters the room, the instant your thoughts become too heavy, you've trained yourself to escape. That training has consequences, because every time you avoid discomfort, you also avoid the growth hidden inside it. And eventually, your entire identity becomes organized around emotional avoidance. You stop pursuing truth. You pursue relief. Massive difference. One creates strength. The other creates dependency. This is why so many people feel lost despite having endless access to entertainment, advice, and opportunity. Because information does not create transformation. Confrontation does. You can listen to discipline videos for years and still remain weak if you never deliberately expose yourself to resistance. And deep down, you know this already. You've felt it during moments nobody else saw. The strange emptiness after hours of stimulation. The guilt after wasting entire nights consuming meaningless content. The quiet disgust that appears when you realize how fragmented your attention has become. The awareness that your mind no longer feels sharp, calm, or dangerous. Just busy. Constantly busy. Modern life has convinced people that mental occupation equals purpose. It doesn't. Many people are overwhelmed precisely because they're living without purpose. Their lives are filled with movement but empty of direction. So they chase emotional highs instead. Vacations, purchases, status symbols, online attention, temporary distractions marketed as fulfillment. But pleasure cannot replace meaning. And eventually the nervous system realizes the difference. That's when the real crisis begins. Not when someone becomes poor. Not when someone fails. When someone finally gets everything they thought would make them happy, and still feels incomplete afterward. That realization destroys people, because now they have nowhere left to project the fantasy. Now they must confront the possibility that the problem was never external. It was philosophical. They built their entire life around avoiding pain instead of becoming strong enough to endure it. That creates a dangerous kind of emptiness. One that no amount of comfort can fix. You can already see the consequences spreading across society. People terrified of being alone with themselves. Relationships collapsing under unrealistic emotional expectations. Constant anxiety despite endless convenience. Depression inside materially successful lives. An entire generation overstimulated but emotionally underdeveloped. And underneath all of it sits one uncomfortable truth nobody wants to hear. Pleasure without resistance weakens the human spirit. The modern world accidentally turned happiness into a form of anesthesia, not fulfillment, numbing. And once you recognize that, you start seeing the system differently. You notice how often discomfort is treated like failure. How every inconvenience gets medicated, optimized, softened, or escaped. How people celebrate ease while secretly craving meaning. How many lives are built around avoiding struggle instead of becoming worthy through it. Because despite what modern culture says, your mind does not grow through endless comfort. It grows through voluntary friction. The gym works because resistance exists. Discipline works because impulses are denied. Confidence grows because difficult situations are faced repeatedly. Self-respect emerges because promises are kept under pressure. Strength is forged against resistance, never around it, which means the very experiences modern people are trying hardest to avoid may actually contain the exact psychological nutrients they're starving for. But that realization requires something most people refuse to do. Stop running. Not forever. Just long enough to see what your distractions have been protecting you from. And that moment changes everything. Because when the noise finally fades, another truth begins to emerge. Your misery may not come from suffering too much. It may come from never allowing yourself to suffer meaningfully at all. There's a difference. A massive one. One destroys you. The other builds you into someone difficult to break. Most people never learn that distinction. They spend their lives chasing emotional comfort while unconsciously becoming weaker with every escape route they create. Then they wonder why anxiety keeps growing despite their lives becoming easier. They mistake convenience for peace. They are not the same thing. Peace is internal stability. Convenience is external efficiency. One survives chaos. The other depends on conditions remaining favorable. And conditions never remain favorable forever. That's the part modern culture hides from you. Life eventually tests everyone. Loss arrives. Failure arrives. Aging arrives. Rejection arrives. Isolation arrives. Pain arrives. And if your entire identity was built around comfort, reality hits you like a psychological earthquake. Because comfort never trained you for impact. Only resistance does that, which means the very thing you've been avoiding may secretly be the doorway to the life you actually want. Not pleasure. Capacity. The capacity to remain calm under pressure. Focused during uncertainty. Disciplined without external validation. Content without constant stimulation. Stable without needing the world to entertain you every second. That kind of strength is becoming rare now, which makes it valuable. And in the next part, you're going to understand why the modern happiness industry depends on keeping you emotionally fragile, because a person who learns how to extract meaning from difficulty becomes almost impossible to manipulate. If this message is exposing something you've been silently feeling for years, press like on this video. Not for the algorithm, for the decision. Comment the phrase, "Comfort made me weaker." Because admitting the truth is the first crack in the illusion. Share this with someone who keeps chasing happiness but still feels empty afterward. And subscribe if you're ready to stop numbing yourself and start rebuilding your mind with intention instead of stimulation. Because once you see the trap clearly, you can never unsee it again. The most profitable business model in modern history is not oil. It is not technology. It is not entertainment. It is emotional instability. That sentence sounds extreme until you examine the world carefully enough to notice what every major system quietly depends on. Your dissatisfaction. Not your destruction. Not your collapse. Just enough insecurity to keep you searching. Searching for upgrades. Searching for validation. Searching for relief. Searching for a version of yourself that finally feels complete. The machine does not need you broken. It only needs you psychologically unfinished. Because an emotionally satisfied person is difficult to monetize. Think about that. If you genuinely accepted yourself, how many industries would immediately lose influence over your behavior? How many purchases disappear when insecurity disappears? How many addictions weaken when inner stillness strengthens? How many algorithms lose power when attention becomes disciplined? This is why modern culture constantly creates new emotional deficiencies for you to solve. You are too behind, too unattractive, too unproductive, too unknown, too average, too late, and the terrifying part is that these standards never stabilize. The target keeps moving because the business depends on movement. A satisfied person exits the loop. An insecure person stays inside it forever. So the system continuously manufactures emotional hunger while pretending to sell fulfillment. That's why the relief never lasts. It was never designed to. Look closely at how modern happiness is marketed. It always lives somewhere ahead of you. After the promotion, after the glow up, after the relationship, after the followers, after the success, after the perfect morning routine, after the optimized life, always after, never now. That is not accidental psychological framing. It is economic architecture. You are being trained to associate peace with future acquisition instead of present discipline. And once the brain internalizes that pattern, contentment becomes impossible. Because now your emotional state depends on chasing outcomes that continuously evolve beyond reach. This creates a dangerous psychological condition. Perpetual arrival syndrome. The belief that life will finally begin once one more condition is met. But conditions multiply infinitely, so the mind never rests. You can see this clearly in people who achieve everything they once wanted and still remain emotionally restless. The expensive apartment becomes ordinary. The career milestone fades. The attention stops feeling satisfying. The lifestyle adapts into normality. Then the hunger returns, always. Not because they failed, because they misunderstood the nature of desire itself. Desire expands faster than achievement. And in a digital world where comparison never stops, expansion becomes uncontrollable. Your brain was never meant to compare itself against millions of lives every single day. But now it does, constantly. You wake up and immediately expose your nervous system to other people's victories, bodies, lifestyles, opinions, wealth, relationships, and performances before your own mind even fully stabilizes for the morning. Then you wonder why your internal world feels fragmented. You are absorbing more comparison stimuli before breakfast than previous generations encountered in months. That changes the structure of identity itself. Because eventually you stop experiencing your own life directly. You experience it relative to everyone else's. And comparison destroys gratitude faster than failure ever could. A poor man can feel peaceful. A wealthy man can feel miserable. The difference is often psychological framing. Modern platforms exploit that reality with terrifying precision. Every scroll subtly communicates the same message. You are not enough yet. Maybe not explicitly, but psychologically. The body absorbs it. The nervous system registers it. The subconscious compares itself against it, over and over again, until dissatisfaction becomes your default operating state. Then something even more dangerous happens. You stop questioning the source of your unhappiness. You normalize it. You call it ambition. You call it hustle. You call it modern life. But there is a difference between meaningful ambition and compulsive dissatisfaction. One builds you. The other consumes you from the inside. Meaningful ambition emerges from purpose. Compulsive dissatisfaction emerges from emptiness. And modern culture has become exceptionally skilled at confusing the two. That's why so many people appear driven while secretly collapsing internally. They are not pursuing excellence. They are fleeing inadequacy. Massive difference. One creates grounded confidence. The other creates endless anxiety disguised as productivity. This is why some people can never rest. Not because they are disciplined. Because stillness forces them to confront unresolved emptiness. So they remain in motion constantly. Working, scrolling, watching, posting, consuming, performing. Movement becomes emotional anesthesia, and eventually, they lose the ability to distinguish stimulation from meaning. That is the hidden crisis underneath modern burnout. Most burnout is not caused by hard work alone. Humans can tolerate extraordinary effort when effort feels meaningful. Burnout often emerges when intense stimulation lacks deeper purpose. When the soul senses that all this motion is leading nowhere substantial. You can feel this in modern corporate culture. People sacrificing their health to afford distractions that help them temporarily forget how much they hate their lives. That cycle should disturb you. Wake up exhausted. Work without meaning. Consume for relief. Repeat. Entire lives disappear inside that loop. Not because people are weak, Because they were conditioned carefully. Conditioned to equate comfort with success. Conditioned to fear stillness. Conditioned to avoid pain at all costs. Conditioned to pursue happiness without ever defining what happiness actually means. And that last part matters more than most people realize. Because the modern definition of happiness is fundamentally unstable. It is built almost entirely around emotional states. Feeling good, feeling excited, feeling validated, feeling stimulated. But emotional states fluctuate constantly. Which means if your identity depends on maintaining pleasant emotions, your life becomes emotionally fragile by design. Ancient Stoics understood something modern culture forgot. Peace is not the absence of discomfort. Peace is the ability to remain stable during discomfort. Completely different philosophy. One demands control over reality. The other demands control over yourself. And only one of those is possible. But self-control is unpopular now because it cannot be sold as easily. Consumption is easier to monetize than discipline. That's why modern self-improvement often becomes another form of addiction. People consume motivational content endlessly while avoiding real transformation. Another podcast, another dopamine spike, another temporary emotional high. But information without action becomes intellectual entertainment. Nothing changes. The person feels productive while remaining identical. That illusion traps millions. And the algorithms love it. Because passive consumption creates more engagement than silent transformation ever will. A disciplined person disappears from the system more often. They stop reacting impulsively. They stop needing constant stimulation. They stop broadcasting every emotional fluctuation publicly. They become harder to emotionally manipulate. That makes them less profitable. So modern systems unconsciously reward emotional impulsiveness instead. Outrage spreads faster than wisdom. Validation spreads faster than restraint. Attention favors extremes over clarity. And slowly, people adapt to the environment around them. They begin performing emotions instead of understanding them. Everything becomes externalized. Pain must be posted. Success must be displayed. Experiences must be documented. Opinions must be announced. Because somewhere along the line, people stopped asking themselves one terrifying question. Who am I when nobody is watching? That silence reveals everything. Because without an audience, most modern identities begin collapsing immediately. The confidence disappears. The certainty weakens. The motivation fades. Why? Because externally constructed identities require external reinforcement to survive. This is why so many people secretly feel empty after receiving attention they thought would satisfy them. Attention amplifies identity. It does not create one. And if there is no stable internal structure underneath the performance, recognition eventually becomes exhausting instead of fulfilling. You see this constantly now. People documenting perfect lives while privately deteriorating psychologically. Smiling online, breaking internally. That contradiction keeps increasing because modern happiness culture trains people to optimize appearance before substance. Looking peaceful matters more than becoming peaceful. Appearing successful matters more than building a meaningful existence. Curating identity matters more than understanding identity. But performance cannot nourish the soul. Only truth can do that. And truth usually arrives through discomfort, not pleasure. That is why your most transformative moments rarely feel good while they are happening. Failure humbles you. Loss clarifies priorities. Isolation exposes dependency. Discipline rebuilds self-respect. Responsibility sharpens character. Pain forces confrontation. Pleasure often delays it. That does not mean suffering itself is noble. It means voluntary struggle creates psychological depth that endless comfort cannot produce. A person who has faced resistance consciously becomes different. Calmer. Sharper. More difficult to destabilize emotionally. Because they no longer panic every time life stops feeling pleasant. They understand something fragile people never learn. Discomfort is not danger, it is information. And once you stop treating discomfort like an emergency, your entire relationship with life changes. You become less reactive, less desperate, less dependent on constant emotional rewards. That creates freedom, real freedom, not the modern version built around unlimited consumption. Internal freedom. The ability to remain composed without needing external stimulation every moment. Most people have never experienced that state. Their minds are too noisy, too conditioned, too addicted to interruption. Even moments of rest become contaminated by stimulation. Think about how many people cannot eat without watching something, cannot walk without headphones, cannot sleep without background noise, cannot sit alone without immediately reaching for a screen. The silence terrifies them, because silence removes escape routes. And eventually, every unresolved thought returns at once. That is why many people stay overstimulated intentionally. Not consciously, psychologically. They fear what stillness might reveal. But avoidance compounds suffering over time. Everything ignored grows heavier. Ignored emotions, ignored fears, ignored weaknesses, ignored truths, and eventually the weight becomes unbearable. Then people call it anxiety, burnout, emotional exhaustion. But underneath many of these conditions sits something deeper. Chronic self-avoidance, a life spent escaping inward confrontation. That is why endless pleasure eventually becomes exhausting. Because the nervous system knows when stimulation lacks meaning. You can distract yourself temporarily. You cannot deceive yourself forever. Sooner or later, reality breaks through. Usually during quiet moments, late nights, long drives, unexpected silence, emotional crashes after temporary highs. Moments where the performance weakens and truth enters the room. And the truth is often painful. You are not tired because life is too hard. You are tired because your mind has become dependent on artificial emotional regulation. Constant stimulation, constant comparison, constant distraction. Your nervous system never recovers because it never truly rests. Rest is not entertainment. That distinction matters. Watching endless content is not recovery. Scrolling is not recovery. Consumption is not recovery. Most people are not resting. They are sedating themselves. And sedation slowly destroys clarity. That's why modern people often feel mentally foggy despite consuming more information than any generation before them. Too much input, not enough reflection. The mind becomes crowded, and a crowded mind cannot hear truth clearly. This is why disciplined solitude becomes powerful. Not because isolation itself is magical. Because silence reveals your actual condition. Your addictions become visible. Your emotional dependence becomes visible. Your fragmented attention becomes visible. And most importantly, your potential becomes visible too. Because underneath all the distraction, your mind still remembers what strength feels like. It remembers focus. It remembers stillness. It remembers depth. But those qualities only return when stimulation loses control over you. And that requires something modern culture rarely encourages. Voluntary deprivation. Choosing difficulty intentionally. Choosing restraint intentionally. Choosing silence intentionally. Not to punish yourself. To reclaim authority over your own mind. Because if pleasure controls your decisions, then pleasure controls your identity. And controlled people are predictable people. That's what the modern happiness machine quietly depends on. If this feels uncomfortably accurate, press like on the video. Not as passive agreement, as recognition. Comment. I refuse to be controlled by comfort. Because the moment you recognize the manipulation, your mind starts separating itself from it. Share this with someone who keeps chasing stimulation but still feels emotionally drained afterward. And subscribe if you are ready to rebuild the kind of internal stability this generation is rapidly losing. Because in the next part, you're going to understand why suffering itself is not the enemy, and why the people who stop worshiping happiness often become the calmest, strongest, and most fulfilled individuals in the room. Most people spend their entire lives trying to eliminate pain. And in doing so, they accidentally eliminate themselves. Because pain is not just suffering. Pain is feedback. It tells you where you are weak, where you are dishonest, where you are dependent, where you have built your life on illusion instead of substance. Without friction, none of that becomes visible. Which means a completely comfortable life often produces a dangerously unexamined human being. Modern culture hates that idea. It treats discomfort like a design flaw, a technical problem to solve, an emotional inconvenience to escape. But the human mind does not mature through permanent comfort. It matures through confrontation. That's why some of the strongest people you will ever meet are not the ones who avoided suffering. They are the ones who stopped running from it. Notice the difference. Not people destroyed by pain. People transformed by it. There's a reason those two outcomes exist separately. Suffering alone does not automatically create wisdom. Unconscious suffering can make people bitter, resentful, unstable, cruel. But conscious suffering, chosen, examined, endured with awareness, creates depth. and depth is becoming rare. Because modern life rewards surface-level existence. Fast opinions, fast entertainment, fast validation, fast pleasure, everything immediate, nothing integrated. The result is a generation emotionally overstimulated but psychologically underdeveloped. People who know how to consume information but not how to sit with themselves. People who can perform confidence online while collapsing privately under minor adversity. People who know how to appear alive without actually feeling connected to life itself. That emptiness keeps growing because comfort removes the conditions required for internal development. Think carefully about your own life. What moments changed you most profoundly? It probably was not the easiest season. It was the painful conversation you avoided for years. The humiliation that shattered your ego. The rejection that forced self-awareness. The loneliness that exposed your emotional dependency. The discipline that rebuilt your self-respect slowly, day after day. Transformation rarely enters through pleasure. Pleasure maintains. Pain reveals. That's why modern people often become psychologically weaker despite becoming materially more comfortable. They are protected from every form of resistance except the resistance inside their own minds. And eventually, internal weakness becomes impossible to hide. You can see it in the way people panic under uncertainty now. A delayed outcome creates anxiety. Silence creates discomfort. Boredom creates restlessness. Criticism creates identity collapse. Why? Because a nervous system conditioned for constant comfort loses its tolerance for normal human struggle. This creates a fragile kind of existence. One where emotional stability depends entirely on favorable circumstances. But favorable circumstances are temporary. Always. No amount of technology changes that reality. Life remains unstable. People leave. Bodies age. Plans fail. Loss arrives unexpectedly. Meaning collapses if it was built on externals alone. And if your emotional foundation depends on life remaining pleasant, suffering becomes catastrophic instead of instructive. This is why ancient philosophies emphasized resilience over pleasure. Not because they hated happiness. Because they understood happiness without strength cannot survive pressure. A weak mind only feels peaceful when conditions are controlled. A strong mind remains grounded even when conditions collapse. That distinction changes everything. One creates dependency. The other creates sovereignty. Most people never build sovereignty because they misunderstand the role of discomfort completely. They think discomfort is evidence they are failing. Often, discomfort is evidence they are finally confronting reality. The gym hurts because weakness is being challenged. Discipline hurts because impulses are losing authority. Truth hurts because illusions are dying. Growth feels violent to the ego. Especially an ego built entirely around comfort and avoidance. That's why transformation often begins with identity collapse. The moment you realize the version of yourself you've been protecting is actually keeping you weak. Weak through distraction. Weak through dependency. Weak through endless emotional avoidance. That realization is painful, but necessary, because you cannot rebuild yourself honestly while protecting the habits destroying you. And modern life gives people endless tools to protect destructive habits. Entertainment softens reflection. Convenience softens discipline. Validation softens accountability. Everything encourages escape. Very little encourages confrontation. That's why so many people secretly feel disconnected from themselves now. They spend years managing symptoms without addressing causes. Low motivation. Consume more stimulation. Emotional emptiness. Buy another experience. Mental exhaustion. Escape deeper into entertainment. But none of these solve the root issue. A disconnected life cannot be repaired through stronger distractions. Only through reconnection with reality. And reality is rarely comfortable at first. Reality asks difficult questions. Who are you without constant stimulation? What are you avoiding? What habits own your mind? What truths have you delayed confronting? What would remain of your identity if all external validation disappeared tomorrow? Most people cannot answer those questions honestly. Not because they are incapable. Because they've spent too long numbing themselves. And numbness creates a dangerous illusion. You stop feeling the damage while the damage continues accumulating underneath. That is the true danger of modern comfort. Not immediate destruction. Gradual erosion. Attention erodes. Patience erodes. Self-control erodes. Purpose erodes. Depth erodes. Until eventually people wake up inside lives that feel emotionally sterile. Nothing catastrophic happened. They just slowly drifted away from themselves. One distraction at a time. And the terrifying part is that society normalizes this condition completely. If you are constantly stimulated, constantly busy, constantly consuming, nobody questions it. But if you become still, reflective, disciplined, emotionally restrained, people become uncomfortable around you. Because your stillness exposes their chaos. A person who no longer needs constant stimulation becomes difficult for modern culture to understand. They are no longer emotionally predictable. They can sit in silence, delay gratification, endure discomfort, resist impulse, think independently. That level of internal control feels almost rebellious now. Because most people are being trained toward the opposite condition. Impulse over restraint, comfort over resilience, reaction over reflection, pleasure over meaning. And over time, this conditioning reshapes identity itself. People begin viewing themselves as emotional creatures first. If I feel bad, something must be wrong. If this feels difficult, maybe it isn't meant for me. If I'm uncomfortable, I should escape. But emotions are temporary states, not commands. That lesson alone can transform a life. Because the moment you stop obeying every emotional impulse automatically, your mind starts regaining authority over itself. And authority matters. Without internal authority, you become vulnerable to every craving, distraction, and external influence surrounding you. You become programmable. That's why discipline is far more than productivity. Discipline is psychological independence, the ability to act according to principles instead of impulses. Modern culture quietly discourages this because impulsive people are easier to manipulate economically and emotionally. A disciplined person buys less impulsively, consumes less compulsively, reacts less emotionally, depends less heavily on external validation. They become harder to control. And that control matters more now than ever before because attention itself has become one of the most valuable resources on Earth. Entire systems compete for your focus every second. Not because your attention is harmless. Because your attention shapes your identity. Whatever repeatedly captures your mind eventually shapes your character. If your attention lives in chaos, your mind becomes chaotic. If your attention lives in distraction, your thinking becomes fragmented. If your attention lives in superficiality, your inner world becomes shallow. Most people underestimate this completely. They think habits only affect behavior. Habits reshape perception itself. The things you repeatedly consume alter what feels normal to your nervous system. That's why constant stimulation eventually makes ordinary life feel emotionally flat. Natural pleasures lose intensity. Simple moments lose meaning. Patience weakens. Stillness becomes uncomfortable. And eventually, people mistake overstimulation for vitality. But intensity is not the same thing as aliveness. One exhausts the nervous system. The other deepens it. Real aliveness often feels quieter than modern culture expects. Presence during solitude, satisfaction after difficult work, calmness earned through discipline, meaning created through responsibility, peace that exists without needing constant excitement. Those states are subtle, which is exactly why overstimulated people can no longer recognize them. Their nervous systems are calibrated for spikes, not depth. So they keep escalating stimulation while feeling progressively emptier. More entertainment, more noise, more novelty, more consumption. But emptiness cannot be solved through accumulation. Because emptiness is rarely caused by lacking more. It is usually caused by lacking connection. Connection to purpose, connection to reality, connection to self-respect, connection to disciplined action, connection to silence, connection to meaning deeper than emotional pleasure. That's why people who voluntarily embrace hardship often appear strangely calm compared to people living easier lives. The disciplined athlete, the focused craftsman, the person rebuilding themselves quietly without needing applause. They discovered something the comfort-addicted mind never understands. Meaning grows through earned struggle, not avoidance. There is a certain dignity that emerges when you stop negotiating with every impulse. When you wake up and do difficult things without needing emotional permission first. That changes a person internally. You begin trusting yourself again. Self-respect returns slowly. Mental clarity returns slowly. Emotional stability returns slowly. Not through comfort, through consistency under resistance. And this is where modern happiness culture completely fails people. It teaches them to organize life around emotional states instead of values. But emotions fluctuate hourly. Values endure. If you only act when motivated, your identity becomes unstable. If you act according to principles regardless of mood, your identity solidifies. That solidity creates peace deeper than temporary happiness ever could. Because now your stability no longer depends on feeling good constantly. It depends on knowing who you are. Most people have never experienced that kind of groundedness. Their identities are too externally constructed. One criticism destabilizes them. One failure defines them. One rejection collapses them emotionally. Why? Because they built self-worth on outcomes instead of character. Outcomes fluctuate. Character compounds. That is why disciplined suffering becomes transformative. Not because suffering is enjoyable. Because it exposes what remains when pleasure disappears. And whatever remains is your actual foundation. That truth scares people, because many discover they have built entire lives around avoiding themselves. Avoiding silence. Avoiding responsibility. Avoiding vulnerability. Avoiding discipline. Avoiding truth. But avoidance has a cost. Every avoided truth eventually collects interest. And one day the bill arrives psychologically. Usually in the form of anxiety without clear cause. Emptiness despite success. Restlessness despite comfort. Exhaustion despite convenience. The soul knows when a life lacks substance, even if the world applauds it. That's why external success without internal stability feels strangely hollow. You can fool audiences. You cannot fool your nervous system. Deep down, it always knows whether your life is aligned or fragmented. And alignment only comes through honesty. Brutal honesty. About your habits, your addictions, your distractions, your weaknesses, your excuses. Most people avoid that confrontation forever. But the few who face it become different. Not louder. Not more performative, stronger quietly, the kind of strength that does not need constant validation because it was built internally. And in the final part, you're going to understand how to rebuild that internal strength deliberately in a world designed to fracture your attention, weaken your discipline, and keep you emotionally dependent on comfort forever. There comes a moment in certain people's lives when pleasure stops feeling convincing. The entertainment still plays, the notifications still arrive, the distractions still work temporarily. But something underneath begins resisting. A quiet awareness. The realization that you have spent years consuming stimulation while starving the deeper parts of yourself. And once that awareness appears, the old life starts feeling artificial. Not immediately. At first, it feels subtle. You notice how exhausted you feel after endless scrolling. How empty certain conversations sound. How performative modern ambition has become. How much of society is built around emotional escape disguised as lifestyle. You begin seeing patterns other people ignore. The man who cannot sit alone for 10 minutes. The woman who documents every experience because she no longer knows how to experience life privately. The person constantly healing while avoiding discipline completely. The endless pursuit of comfort producing increasingly fragile minds. Everywhere you look, people are medicating existential emptiness with stimulation. And the world keeps encouraging it because numb people are easier to influence than conscious people. But eventually, if you are honest enough, a dangerous question enters your mind. What if the life I actually want requires becoming someone stronger, not someone more entertained? That question changes everything, because now your focus shifts. You stop asking, how do I feel good more often? And start asking, how do I become difficult to break? Completely different philosophy. One creates dependency on circumstances. The other creates internal stability independent of circumstances. This is where real transformation begins. Not in motivation, not in inspiration, not in temporary emotional highs. In responsibility, the decision to reclaim authority over your own mind. And that process starts painfully. Because when stimulation fades, reality becomes louder. You finally notice how fractured your attention has become. How dependent you are on distraction. How uncomfortable silence feels. How quickly your mind reaches for escape the moment discomfort appears. At first, this realization feels humiliating. Good. Humiliation can be useful when it destroys illusion. Because you cannot repair a mind honestly while pretending it is healthy. And modern minds are exhausted. Not because humans are weak by nature. Because they are living in environments engineered to overstimulate every vulnerability they possess. The human nervous system was never designed for infinite novelty, infinite comparison, infinite access, infinite distraction. Yet most people expose themselves to all four every single day, then wonder why they cannot focus, cannot rest, cannot feel satisfied, cannot think clearly. But clarity returns when excess disappears. That's the first principle. Remove before adding. Most people think transformation means acquiring more information, more systems, more hacks, more motivation. Usually, the opposite is true. You need less noise, less distraction, less emotional dependency, less compulsive stimulation. Because underneath all the chaos, your mind already knows what matters. It has simply been drowned out. This is why disciplined solitude becomes necessary. Not as punishment, as recalibration. You need periods where your nervous system stops absorbing constant input long enough to remember what stillness feels like. And initially, stillness feels uncomfortable. That discomfort is important. It reveals withdrawal, not from substances necessarily, from stimulation itself. Most people are not addicted to one platform or one habit. They are addicted to interruption. They cannot tolerate uninterrupted reality anymore. So the first stage of rebuilding yourself is learning to stop escaping every internal sensation immediately. Boredom, restlessness, loneliness, uncertainty. Instead of numbing them instantly, you observe them. You sit with them long enough to understand them. That alone rebuilds psychological strength. Because every moment you resist impulsive escape, you teach your nervous system something critical. Discomfort is survivable. That lesson restores authority gradually. Then another shift begins happening. Your attention sharpens, not overnight, slowly. You stop needing constant background stimulation. You regain patience. You become capable of deeper focus again. Conversations feel more real. Silence feels less threatening. And most importantly, you begin experiencing ordinary life differently. Because overstimulation numbs sensitivity. When the nervous system constantly chases intensity, subtle pleasures disappear. But once excess is removed, simple things regain depth. A walk feels calming again. Work feels immersive again. Solitude feels restorative again. Discipline feels satisfying again. Not because life changed, because your nervous system recalibrated. This is what modern happiness culture never understands. Pleasure sensitivity decreases with overconsumption. Meaning sensitivity increases with restraint. Massive distinction. That's why disciplined people often appear calmer than pleasure-driven people. Their nervous systems are not constantly oscillating between stimulation spikes and emotional crashes. They are grounded. And grounded people become dangerous in a society built around emotional manipulation. Because they stop reacting impulsively. Think about how much power returns when you are no longer controlled by every craving. You can focus longer. Delay gratification. Ignore distractions. Remain calm during uncertainty. Think independently instead of emotionally. That level of control changes your entire trajectory. Not just psychologically, practically. Most modern people sabotage themselves because their impulses own them. They know what to do. They simply cannot tolerate the discomfort required to do it consistently. So they negotiate endlessly. Tomorrow. Next week. After I feel motivated. After life becomes easier. But disciplined people understand something fragile minds never accept. Action creates clarity faster than overthinking ever will. You do not think your way into strength. You behave your way into strength. Repeatedly. Under resistance. That repetition matters because identity is not formed through isolated moments. Identity forms through accumulated evidence. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, the mind records evidence. Every time you resist distraction, the mind records evidence. Every time you endure discomfort voluntarily, the mind records evidence. Eventually a new self-image emerges. Not fabricated confidence, earned confidence. The kind rooted in proof instead of performance. And that distinction changes how you move through life. You stop needing applause for every action. You stop broadcasting every goal publicly. You stop depending on validation to maintain momentum. Because your standards become internal. That is freedom. Real freedom. Not doing whatever feels good emotionally. Being able to act correctly even when emotions fluctuate. Modern culture rarely teaches this because emotional impulsiveness is profitable. A reactive person clicks faster, consumes faster, buys faster, panics faster, but a disciplined mind slows down. It questions, observes, reflects. That pause alone disrupts manipulation. And the deeper your internal stability becomes, the more clearly you begin seeing modern culture for what it actually is. A massive competition for human attention. Everything wants access to your mind. Companies, platforms, advertisers, influencers, political systems, entertainment industries, all competing to shape your perception, habits, desires, and identity. Because whoever controls attention influences behavior. And whoever influences behavior influences destiny. That is why protecting your attention becomes a moral responsibility. Not productivity advice. Responsibility. Because your attention ultimately becomes your life. What you repeatedly focus on shapes what you become emotionally, mentally, spiritually. If your attention constantly lives in outrage, your mind becomes angry. If it lives in comparison, your mind becomes insecure. If it lives in stimulation, your mind becomes fragmented. But if your attention lives in discipline, reflection, purpose, meaning, your identity slowly reorganizes itself around strength. That process is quieter than modern culture expects. Real transformation rarely looks dramatic externally. Usually it looks like waking up and keeping promises consistently, reducing unnecessary stimulation, spending more time in silence, thinking before reacting, choosing long-term meaning over short-term pleasure, training the body, training attention, training restraint, simple behaviors, repeated relentlessly. That is how people rebuild themselves. Not through one motivational breakthrough. Through daily resistance against the impulses weakening them. And eventually something surprising happens. Life becomes lighter, not easier, different, because now discomfort no longer feels like an enemy. You stop interpreting every difficult emotion as evidence something is wrong. You understand that boredom will pass. Urges will pass. Anxiety will pass. Cravings will pass. You stop obeying temporary states automatically. That creates emotional maturity, a quality becoming increasingly rare. Most adults now are physically grown but psychologically reactive. Controlled by mood, controlled by impulses, controlled by external validation. But maturity begins when principles become stronger than feelings. When you can say, I do not need this impulse to control my behavior. I do not need comfort to feel stable. I do not need constant pleasure to feel alive. That mindset changes your relationship with suffering entirely. You stop asking life to remove all discomfort. You ask yourself to become stronger. And paradoxically, that creates deeper peace than comfort ever could. Because now peace is no longer dependent on conditions remaining pleasant. It exists internally. You can feel this difference immediately around certain people. Some individuals walk into difficult situations and remain composed. They do not panic easily. Do not overreact easily. Do not collapse emotionally under pressure. Why? Because they trained themselves through voluntary hardship before life forced hardship onto them. Cold mornings, disciplined routines, uncomfortable truths, delayed gratification, silence, responsibility. These things strengthen the mind gradually, not dramatically. That gradual strengthening matters because resilience compounds exactly the same way weakness compounds. Every avoided discomfort weakens future tolerance. Every faced discomfort strengthens future capacity. And eventually the gap between these two lives becomes enormous. One person becomes emotionally dependent on favorable circumstances. The other becomes internally stable regardless of circumstances. One constantly needs relief. The other develops endurance. And endurance creates something modern happiness culture cannot manufacture artificially. Self-respect. Deep self-respect. The kind that emerges when you know you can trust yourself under pressure. Not because life is easy. Because you became capable. That capability creates calmness. Not the fake calmness of sedation. Real calmness. The kind rooted in knowing your mind no longer panics every time reality becomes uncomfortable. This is why many people secretly admire disciplined individuals even while resisting discipline themselves. They recognize the stability, the focus, the groundedness. They sense that something real exists there. Something increasingly rare in a distracted world. And maybe that is the deeper truth hidden underneath all of this. Human beings were never designed to find fulfillment through endless comfort. They were designed to grow through meaningful struggle. To build, to endure, to master themselves gradually, not to escape every difficult emotion through constant stimulation. That path only creates fragility disguised as happiness. Real fulfillment feels different, quieter, heavier. More grounded. It comes from becoming someone your future self can respect. Someone capable of sitting alone without needing escape. Someone capable of discipline without applause. Someone capable of peace without constant pleasure. That person moves differently through life. And once you become that person, the modern world loses much of its psychological control over you. Because now your happiness is no longer something it can sell back to you. Now it comes from within. If you reached this point, then you already know this message was never really about happiness. It was about freedom. Freedom from compulsive distraction. Freedom from emotional dependency. Freedom from a culture profiting from your instability. So before you leave, press like on this video if you are done allowing comfort to weaken your mind. Comment. I choose strength over comfort. Not for performance, for commitment. Share this with someone trapped in the endless cycle of stimulation, distraction, and emotional exhaustion. And subscribe if you are ready to keep rebuilding yourself deliberately in a world designed to keep you fragmented. Then continue to the next video. Do not break the chain now. Because the moment a person stops worshipping comfort, they begin becoming dangerous in the best possible way.